Well, hello, and welcome to another Barry Hawkins Live, hosted by, unshockingly, Barry Hawkins, which is me. That's right, I'm the only one here. And tonight, we join one another as we move from looking at the events of an effective development process now into the artifacts. The events are the recurring meetings and interactions that are the mechanics of the development process, and the artifacts are the things that we create and curate that provide visibility and a means for shared understanding and collaboration. And we start off tonight with the first and foremost artifact of effective development process, which is the team backlog. Scrum calls the team backlog the product backlog. Sometimes folks will just say generally backlog or queue or work queue. But the backlog is essentially a queue of work that has been identified, recorded, and iterated upon by the team, and it's the queue that they pull work into batches if they're doing a batch development process, or if they have a flow-based development process like a Kanban. They still will often have a backlog or work queue. Or are we talking specifically about batch style team backlogs tonight, and what makes for an effective one of those? I often say that the backlog, a team's backlog is to a team's development process as raw materials are to a manufacturing process. That is to say, the higher the quality of the manufacturing materials, the more smoothly they run through the manufacturing process. And so it is with development teams and their backlogs. Likewise, if you have poor materials and a very poorly kept and curated team backlog, then it's more analogous to cement mix in a wood chipper. Stuff's going in, stuff's certainly coming out, though not necessarily what you expected, and with a whole lot of collateral damage and frustration. So that's what a backlog is. Now, what makes for an effective one? First, I'll say that the development backlog, the team backlog, it should consist of outcomes that are understandable by people outside the team, meaning not only should the team understand the outcomes that are in that queue, but even people outside the team should be able, with some degree of knowledge of who that team is and what they do, should be able to look at the items in that work queue or that backlog and say, oh, okay, that outcome, I understand that outcome, who it's for, and why they would care about it. That's understandable because it's crucial. The backlog does not exist solely for the purpose of the team. The backlog exists also to give visibility to the people requesting or depending upon work from this team, visibility on where the items they're waiting on or that they care about sit in the queue of relative priority. So having those outcomes be understandable outside the team is crucial. Next, an effective backlog, in my experience, typically will range between 3 to 6 cycles worth of content. That is to say, by a cycle, like if you're talking Scrum, a sprint, let's say that a team has a velocity of 40 story points. That is, on a rolling average of the last 6 development cycles or sprints, they average a completion of 40 story points. Well, in that case, an effective backlog for a team with that throughput is going to range between 120 story points and 240 story points. And for the less math inclined, 40 story points times 3, 120. 40 story points times 6, 240. And you want 3 to 6 cycles of content because you have to be looking far enough out. The queue has to be looking far enough out for the team to be able to iterate on, discuss, and refine the items in the backlog. Because when an item first enters the backlog, down toward the bottom or at the very bottom, there's very little detail known at that time. There's only so much detail. There's only so much clarity on how the implementation might be approached and who might work on it. But it's important to have it there to be able to look at planning and projection farther out than just the next 2 weeks or the next 4 weeks. Very few meaningful software projects only need people to be able to give them projections out 2 to 4 weeks. So 3 to 6 cycles, which also if you're a team with 2-week sprints, 6 to 12 weeks worth of work in that queue or backlog is what makes for an effective one. Next, there's a gradient of sorts in the team backlog, starting at the bottom and progressing down to starting at the top and then progressing down to the bottom. There's a gradual, as you go down the backlog further away, right? Because the most immediate thing is on the top. As you go down the backlog, there's a gradual increase in the size of stories and a gradual decrease in the amount of detail in those stories or outcomes in the backlog. Now, why is that? Well, one, there generally tends to be an increase in size. That is, stories get bigger the further out you go, because they are bigger, chunkier, not refined outcomes. They're big placeholders for things we need to know, budget for, think about, and plan toward. And we only know so much about them. And there's only so much value in trying to know more, because that item, as it travels through the backlog, if circumstances or priorities change, it may never even make it all the way into a sprint. It might get pulled out or deferred. And if you spend a bunch of time defining something that far down, it might just be something that ends up getting shelved or scrapped, and then that time was forfeit. That's part of where we're coming from when we talk about deferring decision until the last responsible moment. You want to wait to invest heavily in a story until it's making its way up, because you're going to have more information to inform how you unpack and refine that story, and you're going to have a clearer and better understanding of how you might approach that work and who might work on it. The next point, when it comes to the items in a backlog and how they get in there, generally, the backlog content is created or generated by the product steward, the person who is shepherding the vision for the product or products, and by extension, the backlog and roadmap for what the team is working on. Scrum would call it a product owner. More generally, product steward. That's who's generally populating the backlog. Now, I will say, they're not doing it in isolation. It's done in partnership with the cross-functional members of the team. Because in stewardship, and particularly in product stewardship, and product management being the primary discipline that tends to fill that role, my approach to product management, the way that I talk about it and frame it, is product stewardship. With product stewardship, product stewards, effective product stewards, are storytellers whose primary source material is other people's input. That is, they start with the seed of an idea and where an outcome could go, and they invite the different cross-functional disciplines, the different functional disciplines in the team, into conversation and collaboration to explore possibilities. That's crucial, because if a product steward is creating or generating that content in a vacuum by themselves, they're usually going off assumptions of the last time they did this work, or just what they think that the team might say that they could do. And that's a pretty limited knowledge. That's a pretty limited set of perspective, range of perspective. However, if they come to the team and say, this is an outcome, we want to enable this for our customers, for our subscribers, talk to me about how we could do that. When you come with that curiosity, that when you begin with curiosity and questions, and you invite the other disciplines into collaboration and talking about possibility, what you'll usually find, especially as the trust across the team builds, is that there's more than one way of achieving a given outcome, and it typically has a different amount of impact or feature richness, but also it has each of those different amounts of impact or feature richness also come with different level of effort price tags. And that's crucial information as you're creating content to enter into your backlog, because this one outcome that you're discussing is by no means the only thing that you're going to be asking the team to do, because after all, this is a backlog, this is a queue of work, there's just one more thing in there, right? So it's important to be able to explore those possibilities of what's the range of impact and the commensurate level of effort that we think it would entail, because now we can more deliberately and explicitly decide how much of our effort, how much of our finite bandwidth for schedulable work that we would put toward a given outcome, and making sure that it's the degree of impact and the kind of experience that we're going for, and how we're evolving or creating our product. Now, in partnership with the product steward creating the backlog content, the backlog quality and driving or facilitating the backlog quality is primarily ensured by the team steward through facilitating the development process, ensuring that the team has clarity on definition of done, that we're adhering to our agreed upon practices around acceptance criteria, when and how they're defined. The team steward works, again, not in isolation, but in partnership with the whole team, which includes the product steward. They are ensuring that as stories or outcomes progress up the backlog and get closer and closer to implementation, that the amount, that the size is appropriately evolving, and stories are, very often being broken down into separate, they're being split like into two smaller stories that are more focused and also smaller, therefore easy to estimate more accurately and be clearer on acceptance criteria. And they're ensuring that these things are evolving and happening in a progressive fashion, and with the team's involvement. So those are a few. There's so much more to team backlogs. I believe team backlogs will be things that we'll have multiple episodes on over the coming months. But those are some of the key things that go into having effective team backlogs. All right, let's take a look at what our question submissions have for us today. Our MVP John Mayer provides us with this one. How do you address a team that insists on maintaining a backlog the size of the Library of Alexandria? Ah, yes. The magical bag of holding backlog. So John brings up an important point here, which is backlogs need to be maintained. Content needs to be introduced and groomed or refined as it makes its way up the backlog. But additionally, items that go stagnant or are deferred for long amounts of time shouldn't be allowed to just sit in the backlog and bloat it. An oversized backlog that has lots of long-standing, deferred for quarters items, I've gone into teams and found things from a year and a half, 2-3 years ago that are still sitting in there. I'm talking small stories, like 3s, 5s, little stuff. And there was a poster when I was growing up as a kid, it was kind of a theme, but it would usually be a lady letting go of a dove by an ocean, as you do, and the dove is going away, and then and there was usually like a really heavy filter effect that looked like there was a lot of dust in the air. I don't know what that filter is called, but and then in usually cursive writing, it would say, if you love something, set it free. If it comes back to you, it was yours. If it doesn't, it never was. I don't know how true that is, but anyway, it's a cute little saying. But it reminds me of backlogs because there's so much stuff in your backlog that, just like the little dove in the 70s, you need to set free, because the larger and more unwieldy a backlog is, it's distracting. You come back to it. You look at that. Oh, there's that thing we still haven't done. Oh, there's that one we always said we were going to get to, but then we always decided it really wasn't worth it. But let's look at it again. Let's talk about that one more time. It can be demoralizing, honestly, to a team, and it adds to the cognitive overhead of effective management of your backlog. So, yeah, let it go, just like Elsa. And I'll guarantee you, most of the time, it doesn't come back. But the things that do, I'll guarantee you, you're rarely going to take something out of your backlog that that's been sitting there for a while, that you suddenly think, oh my gosh, we forgot about that. It's usually, if somebody wants it, they're going to come back to you and ask for it again. But if they didn't care about it, or they chose more important things for 6 to 18 months, believe me, let's take it out. I'll say additionally too, in digital systems where you're managing your backlog, oversized backlogs can also make your project, your team project, sluggish and unresponsive. So that's even another less critical factor to consider. So yeah, keep them small. Don't have the Library of Alexandria, as John points out, because another principle from the early days of the Agile and XP movement was this acronym YAGNI, Y-A-G-N-I, which stands for You Ain't Gonna Need It. One of my favorite gifs that conveys how I feel about backlogs I saw many, many years ago, and it was a little kitten on a shelf, and there were items on the shelf, and it's looking down at these little items on the shelf. It's a collection, and it's just swatting them off the shelf, and with every little swat of its paw, in meme text, it pops up, and it's just that's what maybe try that out. Even maybe say those words as you take them out of the backlog. That might be cathartic, and vocationally therapeutic and rehabilitative. So there's that. All right, what else? If I currently only have 2 cycles worth of backlog content, how long would it take my team to get to 6 cycles of content? It depends, but I find that if a team, I will say this, if a team is currently only doing backlog grooming, the introduction, I highly recommend introducing at least one backlog maintenance session. I encourage teams to budget between 1 to 3 backlog maintenance sessions in the course of a development cycle. And if you add in backlog maintenance, I typically find that a team can get to that 6 cycles out in 2 to 4 sprints. 2 to 4, 3 to 4 sprints, usually. Now, there are a lot of factors that impact that, like the amount of interrupt-driven work on your team, how sustainable, like how healthy planned sprints are. That is, they are cycles. They pull in a batch, and that tends to be, it was a full batch, and they complete it all. and the sprints don't blow up or melt down a lot, because when the sprints blow up or melt down a lot, or there are a lot of production incidents or interrupt driven work, and that one of the things that's usually sabotaged first is that proactive maintenance of your backlog. So, there are factors that could impact it, but if you have backlog maintenance in addition to grooming, somewhere between 2 to 4 cycles, you usually get in a much better spot. All right. What is the most common mistake you see with team backlogs? Good question. I think I most commonly see teams whose backlogs are a queue of tasks, not outcomes. So the items in the backlog are not, using the user story template. It's not an outcome, who it's for and why they care about it. Using the user story template as a specific kind of user, I can do the following things so that this thing I care about is realized for myself. Instead, their backlog it's all the work that would go into making that outcome happen, but as items in the backlog. So it's, update the persistence objects, add the component to the front end code. It's literally the work that the team would go do. And so when people outside your team, but really honestly, even when people in the team look at that queue of which tasks and not outcomes, it's really hard to see where the value is. It's like I know you need to do that work. I just don't know what's going to happen when you complete that work. So I would say the most common mistake I see with team backlogs is having a queue of tasks and not outcomes. People outside, and frankly often within your team, rarely care about the tasks. They definitely care about what happens after you've done the task, which should be the outcome. So use outcomes, not tasks. All right. Okay. Let me make sure I read this right. What does too much detail too soon and too little detail too late look like? So there are a number of variables that affect this, but I typically see, well, the too little detail too late is pretty easy. That's, you go into a team's backlog grooming, or heaven forbid, their sprint planning, and there are barely any acceptance criteria, or the team still doesn't agree on the story point size of the story, conditions of success, definition of done, shoddy if present at all. That is too little too late. At the point that you're at backlog grooming and there's not even enough detail for the team to feel good about, this would be good going into the next sprint, but especially if you're planning the next sprint and that detail is lacking. That's too little detail too late. Now, too much detail too soon is a little more nuanced. But to give some general guidance, I'll say that beyond, when there's a lot of detail, more than 3 sprints out, so using again the 40 point velocity, so if somebody had 240 points worth of stories, six cycles worth, when you get down below that, so 1 sprint, 2 sprint, 3 sprint, when you get down below, you get halfway through the queue, if there are really small stories with a lot of detail, that's usually a bit too early, especially if it's in 5 or 6 sprints out. There are exceptions to that, but it probably comes down to questions for the team to ask itself, which is, stories that we're being that specific about that early, do they actually make it into a sprint? Or do they get, pulled before time? Or by the time they get up to backlog grooming to go into the sprint, has the detail changed so much that it doesn't even look like the same story it was when it was, 5 sprints out as opposed to 1 sprint out? Well, if that's the case, if there's that much change, then experimenting with having just enough detail to be clear on the outcome, who it's for, whether they would care about it, and having a high level understanding of, well, we generally think these are 8s because we've done a billion of them, or we're saying this is a 20 because we know it's going to be bigger and chunkier. It's probably going to become 2 or 3 stories. Experiment with that amount of detail and see if it gets you enough for accurate planning and projection without specifying detail that ultimately ends up getting scrapped or completely revamped because there was so much change in between when you invested all that time and when it was actually, time to act on that story. All right. Can bugs go in the backlog? This is a question I've gotten a lot over the years, and even into some of my earliest years in Agile, this is a question I was getting as early as 2005, 2006. Yes, bugs can go in the backlog, but let me explain. Because the definition of bug varies from team to team, from organization to organization. Some organizations would define a bug as any ticketed amount of work that a member of the QA discipline does. Now, in a team that's practicing Agile development process, that is usually not the definition, because any ticketed amount of work that a QA person does, it could be in service of helping to remediate a bug, or testing development work that's done, and that's just a task. That's a task that's part of delivering a story. But a bug, and not just in isolation myself, but in partnership with QA leaders and directors that I've worked with over the years, we have typically agreed upon the definition of a bug as a defect that has been surfaced on work that has already been done and delivered. That's a bug. Defects that QA finds while developing or delivering a story, that is, like, here's a story, we've tasked it out, the engineering team got through their work, the QA team member went to do their first pass at executing the test plan against it, and it failed. So the QA member had to bring the work back and say, hey, it didn't pass the test plan. These are the issues that I found. And so the QA member has to add another task. The engineering team member has to add another task to resolve the issues that were found. That is typically not a bug for me, but rather it's just more work that goes into delivering that story. The bug is when they finished the story and found those problems out after it went into a release. And so bugs, in that definition of a defect found in work that has been already done, those bugs can and do go into the backlog. Now, sometimes they're an emergency because it's a bug that's found the very next sprint, and it's like, hey, this is an interrupt-driven thing. It's not passing through the backlog. We are fixing it now. And that's in your development log. That would go into your non-backlog items, because that bug did not travel up through your backlog and get pulled into a sprint, right? It was just an interrupt-driven thing. But for bugs that are like, well, this is not great, but it's not experience-breaking, it's not a severe or critical bug, well, that's a bug that can go into your backlog, and maybe it can wait for a sprint or a cycle or two, or 3. So those kinds of bugs that can be serviced at a later point, totally go into the backlog, because it's another outcome. Resolving a bug is an outcome, just like a user story is an outcome. So yes, bugs can go in the backlog. Well, that is our time together on effective team backlogs. We'll be continuing with the other artifacts of development process. As always, if you found this useful, please like and subscribe. There's more content coming on this topic, and I greatly appreciate your time. Thanks so much for watching. And as always, I wish you the most effective development process and healthy teams you could possibly have. And we'll see you next time. Thanks.